The United States has allowed its athletes to cheat in international sports for a decade now, including in the Olympics, according to the World Anti-Doping Agency, which is the international monitoring group that makes sure that athletes do not use illegal drugs. The World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, published this bombshell statement in August that reveals that since 2011, the US government's anti-doping agency, USADA, has allowed US athletes to use illegal substances in violation of sports rules in the name of turning those cheaters into spies. So the US government is allowing its own athletes to cheat and then using them to spy on other countries' athletes, accusing them of cheating. The hypocrisy is extremely blatant. This should be a huge scandal because in 2020 and 2022, Russia was banned from participating in the Olympics over allegations that Russian athletes had been using prohibited drugs. It's also extremely ironic because for political reasons, the US government has been accusing China of supposedly allowing its athletes to use drugs. And this means that at the Olympics this year in Paris, Chinese athletes have been drug tested more than any other athlete from any other country. Chinese swimmers, on average, are being subjected to 21 drug tests per swimmer on the Chinese Olympic team, whereas swimmers from the US Olympic team are only being subjected to 6 drug tests per swimmer. And from European teams or Canada or Japan, those athletes are only being subjected to 4 tests per swimmer. Now, it should come as no surprise that international sporting events like the Olympics are deeply political. They are not apolitical. And the US government has frequently accused foreign countries of engaging in illicit behavior like using drugs, or, for instance, the US Justice Department officially publicly accused Russia and Qatar of bribing FIFA in order to host the World Cup. And now the US government is slated to be hosting the Olympics in 2028 and in 2034. But this scandal means that if the International Olympic Committee actually acts in a neutral way that is not biased in the interest of the US, although that's a big if, because in reality, as I'll show in a bit here, the International Olympic Committee is completely dominated by the West. Almost all of its officials that run the IOC are from Western countries. But if they decide to act neutrally and not in the biased interests of the United States, this means that the US may be blocked from hosting the Olympics in 2028 and 2034. Now, a quick point of clarification that's important. The US Anti-Doping Agency claims to supposedly be independent and claims it's not a governmental organization. That's very misleading. The US government funds the USADA, and the US Congress oversees the USADA. So technically, it's not directly run by the US government, but it's essentially a semi-governmental organization. Claiming it's an NGO, a non-governmental organization, is completely misleading. Now, the scandal started when Reuters, the British mainstream media outlet, published an article on August 7th titled, "Athletes Undercover? Global and US anti-doping agencies clash over tactics." This headline is very misleading. In reality, this is about how the US government has allowed its athletes to cheat for a decade, and Reuters is portraying it as a political disagreement. But Reuters' bias is not that surprising because we now know that during the first Cold War in the 1960s and 70s, the British government funded Reuters in order to spread propaganda and disinformation against the Soviet Union and other countries with socialist governments. But despite its bias, Reuters obliquely acknowledged the fact that the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, has accused the US agency, USADA, of breaking the global code by letting several athletes it caught between 2011 and 2014 violating drug rules go undercover and keep on competing without prosecution in exchange for information on other violators. And the US government claims that the tactic is necessary and allowed and wants to keep using it. Now, that is completely absurd. The World Anti-Doping Agency has explicitly said this was not allowed, and several US athletes have been breaking the rules for years now. In the statement, WADA notes that the US agency has allowed athletes who had doped to compete for years without ever publishing or sanctioning their anti-doping rule violations. This US government scheme threatens the integrity of the sporting competition, and USADA was in clear breach of the rules. And it notes that despite the false claims by USADA, WADA did not sign off on this practice of permitting drug cheats to compete for years. And when WADA found out about this non-compliant practice in 2021, a decade after it had started, WADA immediately instructed USADA to desist. And WADA found examples of at least 3 cases where athletes who had committed serious anti-doping rule violations were allowed to continue to compete for years while they acted as undercover agents for USADA. And in one of these cases, at an elite athlete level, there was an athlete from the US who illegally used these drugs, cheated, and competed at the Olympics and other international events, and admitted to taking steroids and other dope, and yet was permitted to continue competing all the way up to retirement. Their results were never disqualified, the prize money was never returned, they were never suspended. The athlete was allowed to line up against their unknowing competitors as if they had never cheated. And the US claimed that this would put the athlete's security at risk. But that's what the US always says. This is obviously an excuse. Now, what is also part of this scandal is that WADA did not say anything, and WADA said it was put in an impossible position and it had no choice but to agree. I think that's an excuse. WADA should have publicly disclosed this. The US government has been allowing cheating now for years with no consequences, and WADA says, oh, we had no option but to allow this for years because we were afraid of endangering the cheaters that the US has been supporting. That's an excuse. This statement from WADA notes that the athlete's doping was never made public. And it notes that there are other examples of, quote, high-level athletes from the US who were cheating. And then WADA concludes this statement saying, I'm going to read this quote, this is an exact quote. How must other athletes feel knowing that they were competing in good faith against those who were known by USADA to have cheated? It is ironic and hypocritical that USADA cries foul when it suspects other anti-doping organizations are not following the rules to the letter, while it did not announce doping cases for years and allowed cheats to carry on competing. And by the way, this is just scratching the surface of the scandal here. In fact, in July, the World Anti-Doping Agency put the USADA under a compliance review, accusing the US government-funded agency of violating the rules. I'm reading here from Reuters. The World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, will take the United States Anti-Doping Agency, USADA, to the Independent Compliance Review Committee next month, which would be August, and this could jeopardize the US hosting of the 2028 and 2034 Olympics. This is a result of the US government-funded agency accusing, drumroll, Chinese athletes of supposedly doping. This is from 2021. The US accused 23 Chinese swimmers of supposedly doping, but in reality, an investigation that was accepted by the World Anti-Doping Agency showed that this was because of contamination from a hotel kitchen where the Chinese team was staying. So this was a false accusation of doping against the Chinese team made by the same US government-funded agency, which for a decade now, has allowed US athletes to use drugs. So here we can see how the Olympics once again have become a political battleground. Even British state media, the BBC, acknowledges that there's a kind of US-China conflict. This is the new Cold War that the US is waging against China. And the BBC interviewed the head of media relations for WADA, who said that, quote, certain individuals in the US are attempting to score political points purely on the basis that the athletes in question are Chinese. The result is that the US has created distrust and division within the anti-doping system. And this is why Chinese athletes are being harassed with a ridiculous number of dope tests, drug tests, on average, at least for the swimming team, 4 times more than members of Western teams, because the US has weaponized these allegations for political reasons to try to kneecap China, its major geopolitical adversary. And in fact, China's anti-doping agency is accusing the US of not actually taking action against its athletes who use illegal drugs. And in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, China's agency accused the US, 31% of US athletes, of not having sufficient drug tests in the 12-month period before the 2020 Olympics. So what has been the US government's response? Well, the US Congress is now threatening to cut funding for the World Anti-Doping Agency. This was reported on July 30th by Reuters. So the US government is saying, if you are going to take action against our athletes who cheat, fine. We're not going to fund the organization. We're going to pull out because it's our way or the highway. This shows how extremely hypocritical it is when the US State Department talks about the so-called rules-based international order, in which, of course, the US makes the rules and orders everyone around. In reality, we can see that despite the fact that Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, constantly talks about the so-called rules-based order, it's in fact the US that violates the rules that it creates, but it expects other countries to follow those rules while Washington just does whatever it wants. I mentioned earlier that Russia was banned from participating in the Olympics in 2020 and 2022 over accusations that the Russian team used illegal drugs. Well, we now know that the US has allowed these illegal drugs to be used for over a decade now with no consequences. In fact, the double standards get even worse when you realize that this year, 2024, Russia and Belarus were banned again. And why? Because of the war in Ukraine. This was made very clear. It was a political decision. This was stated openly by the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, on its website. A statement in February 2022 from the IOC Executive Board says that Russian and Belarusian athletes should not be allowed to compete, citing the war in Ukraine. And the IOC Executive Board wrote in the statement that it, quote, reaffirms its full solidarity with the Ukrainian Olympic community. What about the Palestinian Olympic community? What about the Iraqi Olympic community? In 2003, the US government invaded Iraq in a blatant war of aggression, and the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, said very clearly, quote, it was illegal. He said that the US violated the UN Charter in this illegal war of aggression. And this is not to mention the fact that the US also invaded Afghanistan, waged war on Syria, waged war on Yemen, waged war on Libya, bombed Somalia, bombed Pakistan. The list of US wars goes on and on and on. And there have been no consequences for the US, which is always allowed to participate in the Olympics while allowing its athletes to use drugs and waging war around the world. According to Brown University's Costs of War project, as mainstream as it gets from a prestigious Ivy League US university, they estimated that after 9/11, after September 11, 2001, the US killed 4.5 to 4.7 million people in the wars that it waged in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Around 1 million people were directly killed in the violence, in a very conservative estimate, and another 3.6 to 3.8 million people were killed indirectly because of these US wars. 38 million people were displaced because of these US wars. Zero consequences. The US is participating right now in the Olympics. And not just the US, Israel is also participating in the Olympics while brutally bombing Gaza with billions of dollars of weapons provided by the United States and full political and diplomatic backing from the United States. No consequences. What about the Palestinian athletes who have been killed by Israel with US weapons? What about the Palestinian athletes whose families are living under illegal Israeli military occupation for decades now with no consequences? Israel faces no punishment from the International Olympic Committee. The International Criminal Court's prosecutor said he was going to apply for an arrest warrant against Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Gaza. And what happened? The British regime, which is supposedly a democracy, it's not a democracy, it's a monarchy, and even if it weren't a monarchy, it's a plutocracy, an oligarchy, and a colonialist regime. The UK is not a democracy. They are preventing the ICC from actually charging Benjamin Netanyahu, the far-right Israeli leader, with crimes against humanity. So he has carte blanche to just continue committing crimes against the Palestinian people with no consequences. Once again, this is what the West refers to as its beloved rules-based order. They make the rules and they order everyone else around, and when it's convenient, the Western colonial powers violate those rules, but then they expect international organizations to take action against Russia and China and Iran and their other adversaries. Well, they do whatever they want. Well, they back horrific war crimes that literally kill millions of people in Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen and Syria and Palestine. The last thing that I'll say here before I conclude is that this hypocrisy starts to make more sense when you look at some of these international organizations and see who runs them. And in reality, you can see that these so-called multilateral, so-called global organizations are almost entirely dominated by the Western colonial powers. Look at, for instance, the executive board of the International Olympic Committee. This is the IOC executive board list on the website. You can see that almost all of them are from Western countries. Look at their last names. The vast majority of them are European, and then there are a few from some other Western countries. And they have like 2 or 3 token members from the Global South, usually from Global South countries like Singapore and Jordan that are closely allied with the West. The Western colonial powers control the International Olympic Committee. The president of the committee, Thomas Bach, is from Germany. Vice President John Coates is from Australia. Another vice president is Dutch. Her name is Nicole Hoverts, and she's from Aruba. People might say, oh, well, she represents the Caribbean. No, Aruba is a Dutch colony. Literal European colonialists run the International Olympic Committee. Another vice president, Juan Antonio Samaranch, is from Spain. Executive board member Dennis Oswald is from Switzerland. Another executive board member, Nada Lalovic, is from Serbia. Fellow member Ivo Ferriani is from Italy. Their executive board colleague, Kristen Kloster, is from Norway. Yet another member is from Finland, Emma Terho. Oh, and finally, we found the only member from Africa. Africa, this massive continent with 1 billion people. We finally found that Africa has one representative on the International Olympic Committee's executive board. Her name is Kirsty Coventry, and she's a white African. She's a descendant of European colonialists from Zimbabwe, formerly known as Rhodesia, which was a British colony. So literally, the only African member of the International Olympic Committee's executive board is a white Zimbabwean, a descendant of European colonialists, and she's joined by the only Caribbean member of the executive board, Nicole Hoverts, who is a Dutch colonialist in Aruba. The reality is that the Western colonial powers never ended colonialism. They still dominate these so-called international organizations, and the United States is the leader, the imperial leader, and US imperialism, the US-led imperialist system, is a global dictatorship dominated by the Western colonial powers, and they tell other countries to do the exact opposite of what they do. And then if another country accuses them of hypocrisy, they claim that it's an authoritarian regime. They invade that country. They overthrow the country's government. They impose sanctions. 1/3 of the world's countries are under illegal unilateral US sanctions. And there are no consequences. The US invades countries around the world. The US has 800 foreign military bases. The US has killed literally millions of people in its wars of aggression just in the past 2 decades. And the cherry on top is that the US allows its athletes to use drugs in the name of spying on other countries that allegedly have athletes that use drugs. And they say, oh, well, we're doing it in the name of fighting doping. So we're allowed to cheat in order to find other countries that cheat. I mean, this is the reality of the so-called rules-based international order. Rules for thee, not rules for me. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. This is Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this, and I will see you all next time.